Let's start with an example of how good readers use the 10 habits. First, I'm going to start by looking at the title. Y'all still don't hear me though. This essay was published in Alabama Today on April 29, 2015. Author Alicia J. Brooks. Although I don't get a ton of information from the title, I can infer that the speaker feels frustrated with her audience and she's going to try and get an important point across. I also see it's an essay, so I know this is a non-fiction piece. In other words, this is not made up. Now I'm going to read the first couple of paragraphs and then stop to think about what I've read. Here we go. I begin with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., hoping you'll keep reading. Despite our tendency to sanitize the raw and radical truths Dr. King spoke, if I can pull out a quote, I can usually get folks to listen for a minute. After all, he was all about nonviolence. A riot is the language of the unheard. Last night, I was shocked by the images and predictable reporting coming from my television. Hours passed, and I couldn't move. It's too much, I tell myself. Not again. The conversation in my brain continues. Yes, again, Leisha, pay attention. And so it begins, this soul-piercing experience of acknowledging, again and again, what it means to be black in these United States. That's me on the screen. That's me you're talking about. I can't turn away. I can't. All right. So now that I've read the first few paragraphs, I'm going to stop here and I'm going to use the habits of good readers to figure out what all of this means. First, I'm going to start by looking at this reference to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I've learned a lot about him, so I'm going to activate some prior knowledge. I know that he was a leader in the civil rights movement who spoke out against segregation and discrimination, so I can infer that this is probably going to be an essay about civil rights or inequality of some sort. I got kind of stuck on the second sentence, which is why I highlighted it. I don't know what a tendency to sanitize raw and radical truths means, so I'm going to have to think about that for a second. So I just stopped to ask a question, and I'm going to read it one more time. Despite our tendency to sanitize the raw and radical truths Dr. King spoke. Well, I know that to sanitize means to clean, so I'm thinking maybe this means that people tried to water down or oversimplify what Dr. King was actually trying to say when they quote him. That makes sense because it seems like the author also feels misunderstood or unheard. Let's go back to that quote. That's kind of an interesting quote that the author chose, and I think I see a literary device there. I remember learning about metaphors or comparisons that are not literally true. In this case, the author is comparing the riot to a language of the unheard. So it seems like Dr. King is comparing riots and language to explain how the people rioting are doing so because they've been ignored for so long and they can't sit quietly and suffer any longer. Now I'm going to think about some of the key things that the author has said and see if I can find a central idea. In orange, I've highlighted some key evidence to help me draw conclusions. First, I'm thinking about the date that this essay was published. Then I'm thinking about some of the clues that the author gives us about how she feels. So, for example, she says she's shocked by the images on her television. She's thinking about what it means to be black in the United States. So I can infer based on the date that this was published and the other evidence that I've highlighted in orange that this author is probably referring to riots that took place following an incident of police brutality. Specifically, I think the author's talking about the riots in Baltimore after the murder of Freddie Gray. And I know this because if I open up Google and I type in the date and use the keyword riots, it'll pop right up, the Baltimore riots with Freddie Gray. So I just used some evidence to help me make an inference, even though the author didn't say she was talking about Freddie Gray specifically or police brutality. I can make an inference that that's what she's talking about, just taking a look at the evidence and the clues that she's left me. So now that I've got the gist of the first few paragraphs, I think that I've figured out the central idea so far. Like Dr. King and the rioters, the author feels like the pain and anger she feels about racial injustice is not heard or understood by white Americans, since police brutality continues to be a problem over and over again. There are many central ideas in a text, so now that it's your turn to read the rest of the article and give the habits of good readers a try, I want you to see if you can figure out what another central idea in the article is. Use your habits of good readers, and good luck.